Welcome to Credit Recovery, the show that advocates for the empowerment of Canadian consumers, promoting financial literacy, discussing all topics of credit, finances, career, and businesses, and more. I'm Kevin Hodge. Today we're talking about disputes versus paralegal-backed audit. So we want to jump right into this. I want to discuss credit bureau checks and reporting in the landlord and tenant relationship where privacy concerns are an issue. So across the internet and my email list, there's tons of questions, complaints coming from the landlord and the tenant side. So I want to talk about the obligations and the rights where credit bureau checks and reporting is an issue. Now, to do that, we want to look at the Personal Information Protection and Electronics Document Act, which really governs this particular issue. Now, there's a brief guideline and it talks about the privacy in the landlord and tenant relationship. It speaks to the fact that a landlord can ask for this information, but there must be knowledge and consent, and this knowledge and consent must be valid. So there's two scenarios where credit checks as well as reporting need to really be understood. So there's the application process where the landlord might ask for certain information, and they have to be clear that it's going to be disclosed for the purposes of checking your credit information and your payment habits so that they can make a decision on if they're going to have you as a tenant. The other issue is when the landlord and tenant relationship has formed, whereas the landlord on a defaulted payment wishes to disclose those payment habits to a consumer reporting agency. Now, at those two scenarios, they both need a valid consent, which is your knowledge and your consent. So when we're looking at valid consent under the Personal Information Protection and Electronics Act, we have to look at 6.1, which generally says that you have to understand not only the nature and purpose, but also the consequences of the collection. We all know that if negative information is reported to your credit file, that it decreases your credit score as well as other consequences that you might be denied credit. So not only does the purposes of the collection of the information to disclose to consumer reporting agencies, it must also, the landlord must also talk about the consequences that this information may harm your credit history, your credit file. So it has to speak to the consequences of the collection and the reporting of that information so that you can make an informed decision if you are going to consent to that information being disclosed. Now, a landlord should be careful in how much information they're also collecting. So for a credit check, the landlord needs your name, address, date of birth. They don't need anything further to run a credit check. So if they ask for anything else, it's not needed for a credit check. Now, in the event there was not a valid consent either during the application process, because doing that, it will result in a hard inquiry, or during, the landlord and tenant relationship where credit information was reported to a consumer reporting agency given payment habits, then you may have the opportunity to dispute this. And we suggest that you dispute it under the Consumer Reporting Act directly to consumer reporting agencies. But if you're not accurate, you have to be careful because your investigation can get closed if you are inaccurate in your dispute. So I hope this information was helpful. Our process is paralegal backed, and you can ask the credit repair companies if they do that. When we go after the negative items on your report, our paralegal engaged letters carry serious weight. Today's episode is brought to you by Lendit, and Lendit is a consumer guide that provides information to consumers so they know where to go when they are shopping for credit based on their score so that they can stop getting dinged on their credit report and increase their chances of getting approved for credit. Thanks for listening to Credit Recovery. Before we go, be sure to show some love to your favorite podcast by leaving us a review. Stay tuned next week for our next episode. Thanks for tuning in.